I think you said you don't really watch many horror movies.
Listen, I have anxiety issues, and so I get enough terror in my day-to-day life that I don't need to go seek it.
If you think about it, and this kind of goes back to what we've talked about in other episodes, where it's like people create the context that makes certain considerations permittable. So you have just like you wouldn't you wouldn't talk about like the power of love in like an R-rated like art house film generally, right?
That'd be
Well,
hilarious if you did.
but in a kids movie you do, right? And so in that same vein, just darker, I find it interesting to think about how Halloween and horror movies are essentially people like having like a dark version of therapy in a way. Because, for example, Hellraiser is a well classic horror series in the sense that the first two movies are good, and there have been many since then. But they recently remade one or rebooted or whatever the hell they call it, and apparently it was good. But you probably haven't seen Hellraiser before, I
Nope.
assume. So
Nope.
essentially, there's this box called the Lament configuration, and then if somebody opens it, it essentially opens a gate to hell. And then these, I don't know if they're ever called demons, but they're essentially demons. They're like really people. Um, Basically take you back to hell, but with like chains that dig into your body and take you back. Like it's pretty
Damn.
messed up. And it's like they essentially maximize like the notion of like pleasure or like pain and so on. But the interesting thing is that a lot of it is kind of based in a twisted sense of morality, where it's like when you want to go too far or when you don't know when to stop, kind of like a flying too close to the sun kind of thing. So it's interesting how there's that element. There's also how like in every horror movie, the people who screw are the ones who die generally. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Like, so it's interesting to me, even just as like the psychological exercise of how people aren't willing to talk about this stuff like in the open air generally. At least, well, now everybody wants to talk about everything, but historically, horror's been this way of being able to talk about taboo things and look at them and address them while still like kind of maintaining that distance of, oh, there's nothing wrong with me because this is horror, right?
It's basic. I mean, horror stories are still just that. They are stories, right? Whether they're true or made up, they, to your point right now, they serve a purpose to help. Like any storytelling really is a way of us being able to like sort through shit. If it gives us a opportunity to put ourselves in someone else who's not us in their position from their perspective and analyze whatever the story's about, right?
Mm.
So I think when we have natural, it's like one reason horror is very attractive to people is like we have natural instinctual fears, right? So if we can see them played out in other people in other ways, it can be entertaining and it can be helpful with us, like to your point of this like taboos we don't talk about. It can
Mhm.
be helpful to explore things that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise explore, like in a very direct conversation with people.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how even the trends of like the themes that they're about kind of reveal like the things that people are afraid of and that they're obsessed with. Like even just the notion of like vampires and immortality harkens to people's fear of the fact that we're not immortal, we're going to die, right? There's nothing you can do to avoid it happening. And most people spend their entire lives running from the reality of what's going on around them. At least that's how I see it. People, others will call me, a bit of a pessimist. I think it's more just realism. But
I agree with you. Well, I think it's the way our personal society views death,
mm,
because not every society looks at death the
true.
way that we do. But it is like this ultimate scary thing that our culture doesn't really talk about. And how many themes in horror have to do with death or dying, or someone's going to die, or the killer is going to get you, or the undead zombies are going to come back from being dead to kill you. Like, it's like the ultimate fear. And it's way easier to play it out in these sort of fanciful stories, right? Than it is to be like, hey, Isaac, did you know you probably have like maybe 60 years left on the planet? Like, you know what I mean?
Honest, like it probably more like 40. Like
I hope not. I hope you
you-
get 60.
like, well,
60
that's the
good
thing.
ones.
If you think of like, what if the statistics of like average lifespan are just exaggerated for like people who die of like, I mean, there's no such thing as far as I'm aware of actually dying of old age. It's just what the result of, you know, the cellular deterioration and whatever, like what that brings about. But what if that's just about like, natural causes in quotes? And like most people, like if you actually average it out, like think about it. You think of like kids who get hit by cars or like somebody who overdoses, like all the things that are going on in the world, there's no way the vast majority of people are dying at 73. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I feel like I see your point, but I think statistically we have numbers on that show us that they are, on average, they are.
I don't know, man.
Well, I guess there's a difference between average life expectancy and average length of life. Does that make sense?
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is you're expected to live to like, I don't know. This is, to be fair, I actually don't know what the difference would be, but I'm sure there is one, because science and statistics are and very specific.
Right. See, and even, I mean, even there, that's more of a society thing, less than a horror thing. But even
Yes.
there, like, even just the fear that people have of looking at things like that from an objective standpoint speaks more to it as well. I mean, unless you're Lana, who apparently is immortal, according to the comments. But she'll have to share her secrets someday.
Yeah.
The element of like, I mean, aging, I think there was a movie recently where like people, I think if you like go into the water or something like that, like it rapidly ages you or something like that. I don't know what
Oh, Old.
it's
I think
okay.
the movie is called Old, and I think it was just being on the island, like this area of the island. I didn't see it though.
Neither did I. That's why I'm not remembering it accurately. But it's just cool to me because there's nothing about subject matter that is scary. It's all about your interaction with it, right? Just like how
Your
there's
perception
nothing,
of it. Yeah.
yeah, just like how there's nothing annoying, there's nothing encouraging, there's nothing that's anything. It's literally just your reaction, your response to that thing.
I think you could
Psychologically,
argue. Right, yeah. Yes.
right? Like, I mean, something that's physically harmful. Like if you
Yes.
take
Like
a
pain.
swan dive into a wood chipper, then that's
Yeah.
harmful. It's pretty
But
difficult
even
to go
you
ahead.
could even at that point be like, well, it's a sensation. Are you labeling that sensation as negative? Right? Like
Yeah,
you could get philosophical about it if you wanted to, but
yeah.
I
I
see what you're
mean,
saying.
there would be a way to look at even that to romanticize it, I'm sure, because you know people are interesting. I'll put it that way. But it's just cool to me as somebody who thinks that most people are just full of and that they just don't want to admit to a lot of things that are actually true. And there's so many other people, particularly nowadays, that are trying to make excuses for them. Whatever side, you know, one might be on, where, you know, it's this thing, that thing. Horror is one of those things that it's just there. It's the same thing as violence. Like you can't argue your way out of whether or not you got punched in the face. You either got punched in the face or you didn't, or you got knocked out, or you got, you know, whatever. And so there's a certain element of like honesty to it, that that's just the rawness of it, that necessarily says like, oh, here it is. Like, no, people are afraid of getting old and dying. Well, you know, it, at least in our, you know, in our culture as we see it. um, I think in even just the relationship between like killing yourself and so on, it changes from culture to culture as well. Because like, for example, in Japan, I mean, when the samurai were like the ruling class, like there was the ritual suicide that you could do, that like if you did something that was humiliating for your family or whatever, you were expected to kill yourself to essentially absolve your family or whoever, whatever thing you're associated with, of the shame associated with what you had done. And
Yeah.
it was just like, like crap.
That's, yeah, coming from, the culture that we're in, it seems very extreme. And I mean, of course, when you're sitting in another culture and like, I don't want to say judging another culture, but trying to conceptualize a different practice that's so different than like what your culture does, it is easy to go, whoa, that's nuts. You really?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's, on the one hand, you have society expecting you to never kill yourself because it's seen as a sin, because it's even
Selfish.
Even if people who are predominantly religious believe that we have less religion in the way that like the Western world, like particularly America and so on, is operating now, which I don't think is inaccurate to say, because there's certainly less than there has been in the past. But the moral fabric of it is still completely soaked in that belief system, because the notion that killing yourself, it's suicide. Like, it's, granted, that is just a term, right? It comes from like Latin or whatever, but it's literally seen as like a crime to want to kill yourself. Like, if you fail to do so, then you're put in like a mental institution or whatever it is. Whereas, another perspective would be like philosophically, it's like, well, if it's your life, then you should be able to choose to end it whatever you want. Or
America.
well,
It's my right to kill myself.
I mean,
Sorry.
but that's the thing. Like, that's not how
But it's
America
not.
thinks.
Yeah, exactly. It's
But
the
then,
irony there, right?
but then you compare that with like how there was the societal expectation of killing yourself in the past in Japan. So it's just interesting to me how like something that we see like doing that as like the end of your rope. It's something that like generally, like, unless you're like extremely depressed, or, well, I guess the other things that would make you extremely depressed, would still, it's still the end result, right?
Yeah.
But I remember, for example, there's like a forest in Japan that's associated. I think it's called the Suicide Forest.
I believe that was the controversial forest that Logan Paul
Yeah,
was. Yes. I only know it from that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's the first time I heard about it as well, which is unfortunate considering that like actual people actually died there, and
Well, it's like if it's well known that that's what that location is, there's got to be family members and people going to look for their kids and their loved ones in there and finding other like it just sounds.
And their loved ones. To distinguish between the two.
Oh yeah. I mean, I also kind of want to go back to something that you were saying earlier about religion, right? Because I think this comes up a lot, even in just like the concept of the movie you were talking about first, where you were like, oh, it's like a box from hell and it drags you to hell. Well, hell is a religious concept, right? So like when you think about when you look back over the last like 600 years and how the church used fear mongering a lot to get obedience or to like drill home the message. And I am not anti any religion. I'm also not extremely educated on everything, but I'm also not stupid. So
the hell model was around before the Judeo-Christian ones as well, so it's still accurate, like Tartarus and other things like that.
Well, and to the point of like what I know most about, which is like Christianity, there's definitely a past of trying to scare the shit out of people to make sure that they repent or that they are living a good Christian life so they can go to heaven and not hell. And if you did, we're gonna need to do XYZ. There's some serious trauma in how certain religions in certain time periods were sending and delivering the message that they were the message of God. Shouldn't use air quotes, Krislyn. Don't use air quotes. But in any case, yeah, I like the idea that certain horror stories or like horror archetypes that we see over and over again sort of sprung out of this, like, God is gonna smite you for being a whore, you know, like there is like, it's not surprising to me that we're seeing it down the line. I hope that most mainstream religions are less fear driven than they used to be, but like in some ways the damage is done in the sense that like those archetypes are still here and with us, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to, because like we both kind of communicated, hell as is understood in the Judeo-Christian element is not the first concept of hell that has been established before, right? There's Hades, which I believe, I don't believe was just a god. It's hard to remember sometimes because
Well, he
they're
was
not
the
really.
he was the gatekeeper of the underworld.
Well, I think the actual gatekeeper of the underworld was Cerberus.
Oh,
Cerberus was the
well,
three-headed dog.
master
Yeah,
in charge of,
that's the thing.
like,
Like, it's hard to tell where like this thing ends because we don't get as much of an education in those, the pantheon religions and such, right? But you had Tartarus, and you had, even the labyrinth, which was kind of, a sub human, well, not subhuman, you know what I mean? Like a non physical world, whatever kind of thing. And I think that that's actually a good example. I love how like our ability to connect ideas is tested by when we go on like tangents, and then we realize like it actually was connected, because as someone who's not religious, who sees the different religions as essentially just an expression of human and sociological thought from the different times, I don't think that it is an accident that the nature of religions changed over time, that the nature of like the pantheons to there is no pantheon, there is only one, and so on, translates also to horror as well, because it's a reflection of the human consideration, right? And even if you have a particular religion that you do have a given faith for, you can still look at the other ones that you don't see as legitimate and look at it that way, because when you think of this notion of punishment, it kind of also reveals the social element of people as well, because we're not we're not mountain lions. We don't operate well. Maybe even mountains. Oh, even Jake Blue is saying nice hat.
thanks, Jake. That's nice.
Oh, and Matt Murphy made a joke earlier. I saw that he said it, and I didn't get it before because I'm not a dad yet. Scared the hell out of people.
Oh, get him, Matt Murphy.
Got it eventually, Matt. But yeah, the notion of you exist within the sphere of consequences that you have on others as well, I think inherently builds in that notion of responsibility, that if you do what is wrong, quotes, then you will be punished. Well, I guess it doesn't need to be in quotes.
No. I think that's pretty literal. Yeah.
So even the notion of horror is that, there is, I think that like Christianity and probably Judaism address this pretty well, in the sense that we all have these temptations, like this thing, that thing, whatever. And then what's our relationship with it, right? Because if we're told that this is wrong, except wrong is a human construct, at least as I believe, then how is your psychology supposed to reconcile the difference between what just occurs to you and what is ideal, as you've learned, right?
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of people who grow up believing that they need to put others first have like such a ridiculously difficult time putting themselves first later on, because then they just feel like, oh, this is just selfish, and so on. So when you have that notion of, oh, this is wrong, it needs to be punished, there's this thing, there's all these different elements, and the repression that's encouraged when people are not comfortable doing this thing. Granted, there are things that if you do, like if you're inclined towards this or that, some of these things you're just never going to be able to act out without a given level of societal punishment anyway. Like
Right.
you can't just beat your boss's, head in because he just like doesn't listen to you when you try to make a point and just expect everything to be okay, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there are less intense things where like if you just want to be able to like to use the boss as an example, like if you just want to point out every way that your boss is a freaking idiot and why this system doesn't work and why all this bureaucratic red tape is literally getting in the way of the things that it's supposedly trying to do, like if you can't do that for 4 or 5 years, the repression that's going to, the effect that repression will have on you is going to build up. And I think that horror, by nature of its intensity, is what helps people vent that out. Because now you're not slapping someone, they're getting their freaking skin torn off and dragged to hell. You know what I mean? I think that over the top intensity is a reflection of the emotion and whatever else that people have repressed. So in that sense, it's almost kind of like a mental coliseum. You get to, live vicariously through the suffering of others. How dare you tell me what I can or can't do? Oh yeah.
Oh, that's a John Locke quote.
Oh, okay. See, you got it. I didn't. There's a lot of them said that.
It's from, I believe that was his name. It's from Lost. That was the guy's name, right? John Locke with the orange lights.
I never watched Lost.
Oh, that was a great show.
I did. Yeah, I don't know. I just wasn't on the train when it was on the tracks, so to speak.
I actually watched it after, like when it went to Netflix or whatever. But in any case, I really enjoyed the way that you described that, and I agree with you on a lot of those points. I think that it makes a lot of sense that like this idea of, it's almost like the purge, right? Like that's a very extreme example of it, but it kind of is to your point of like, society keeps us in this box where primal like expression of emotion is frowned upon, but that's like all you want to do is just like
marshmallow,
unleash the beast, right? And I also keep thinking of this one series of horror movies that I actually have watched 1 or 2 of, and that is the Saw movies. Because the idea of those movies is that like all the people involved have done something wrong, right? Like they're being punished to the point we made earlier of like consequences and punishments. And the guy, I don't remember everything, so like let me know if I'm way off base here.
I didn't really watch the Saw movies because I hate torture, and that's generally how it came across to me. So I won't be able to fact check for you, but
that's all right. But I'm pretty sure the guy who was like catching the people and putting them in these situations, he's got some kind of
you judge me
chip on his shoulder, right?
I think he has cancer.
Yeah, but he's like, I'm gonna like find justice in my own way for what these people have done, kind of deal, right? And I think that kind of comes back to this idea of like fairness and unfairness and judgment and consequence for behaviors and actions and how severe those consequences are. And do you agree with what society is handing out as consequences to actions? And if you don't, like, you know what I mean? Then it's like this, that series of movies is sort of showing, to your point, like a primal emotional reaction of like, I'm disgusted by what these people did, so I'm gonna f them up, So it kind of touches on a lot of the different themes that we've identified so far, of like punishment and consequence, and this we kind of have talked about this underlying theme of justice without saying it, all within the constructs of our society and what we believe to be moral and right and wrong, which, as we know, is pretty much all made up by us. We made it all up. So yeah, just super interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like,
go ahead. Sorry.
I'm interested to know why torture movies specifically, you're like, like why that subgenre of horror. I mean, it makes sense. Don't get me wrong. Like it's gross and awful, but like, I don't know. I'm interested to know more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the thing for me is that So for example, if I see a fight scene where people are like doing like I remember watching one, I won't say what movie it's from, partially because I'm not sure that I would get it right, and also because I don't want to spoil it. But at one point, like these people are fighting, and it like a guy had like he had like tried to do like a kick to somebody who was taller than him, and the guy dodged, but he ended up kicking the light that was hanging instead. And then later on, when he's going to kill this one guy because he was fighting two people, this other guy stabs him in the neck with the lamp thing.
Oh, God. Yeah.
And the guy keeps fighting because he's freaking Asian and he's like powered by discipline and whatnot. He doesn't need blood. He just needs discipline. And it's like it's interesting. But my point is that, not to to sidestep your question, that didn't really bother me too much because it's a fight, right?
Right.
You're just doing what it takes to succeed, compared to the self-righteous, narcissistic perspective you need to come from to be torturing something. Now, granted, there is the active torturing in the sense of, I need information from this thing. Oh, that's enhanced interrogation. But there's when somebody knows something that you don't, and
Yeah.
you want it, and you will take whatever you'll do whatever you can to make it happen. There's certainly the action of simply doing that. But then the way I look at it is torture as even then it disgusts me. But for me, it's that sense that like what you want is so important that this thing, like, to devalue the existence and the pain or whatever of this other thing, it's just disgusting to me because it is so delusional and so like there's just something about it that is just so closed off and so like self-centered and whatever about it, that it's the complete lack of compassion if you think about it.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like even if I don't like somebody, if they do something that I think has value, or if they make a good point or whatever, I do my best to make a point to not just kick that under the rug simply because I don't like them. I want to be fair, and I want the reason I don't like somebody because I'm being fair, and they don't align with that sense of fairness, right? And so for me, that torture thing, and this is the reason why I never watched those movies beyond, I think, like when I was around somebody else who was or whatever, because of the torture, but also just the things like, look, just because you have cancer doesn't mean that everybody else is obligated to, to operate under your sense of what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah. Talk about
fucking
narcissism, right?
Yeah.
And egotism.
Right.
Everyone needs to believe what I believe, or I'm going to kill you in a very specific way.
Right.
Like,
and you need to
unless you earn your life back, which is like pretty impossible.
In my understanding of it, you still need to play by my rules. And so it's
exactly,
as someone who is fundamentally existentialist in the sense of like everybody creates their own meaning in my mind, it's just, it's completely against how I see it. I mean, if you want to do that, okay, but I'm not going to approve of it, so.
You don't approve of torture? That's weird.
No. Even if I had to like actually do it and like not enjoy it, but like in order to get information and like to, I don't know, go save somebody, it'd still bother me. I mean, it probably would bother me less in the moment because I hate that person, but
well, so you make a really good point about this though. And when you were talking about it earlier, I kind of wanted to touch on it, is that like the idea of torturing for information, I would love to see the science, if there is any. I don't know how you would.
Oh, there will
reliably. Well, I don't know if you would reliably and ethically collect information on this, because
it's not available for the public.
Well, prior to Nuremberg trials, the ethics were, you could do more, right? Post that, and post the Stanford Milgram experiments and all these real sketchy things that we did for science.
For science.
So now you couldn't do an experiment that's I wonder, the question I'm getting at, sorry for the long lead up, is how accurate is someone's information that they're giving you when you're torturing them? Are they just saying, at that point, are they just saying anything to get you to stop?
Right.
Have they given you the truth at any point? You have no way of knowing. So like, I know that interrogation skills and types, you called it something earlier. What was it?
Enhanced interrogation, as the U.S.
Yeah,
government calls
that's
it.
a lovely euphemism for
It's
what's
such a
going on.
21st century white person word.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
torture.
Thanks for that, US Gov. But anyway, I know that it is used, unfortunately, but like I just don't know the efficacy of it. Like, do you even get much out of it? And I think the reason we see it so often in horror movies is because like that's gotta be one of the most primal fears. Is like, because it's not just like I'm going to get hurt, it's that I'm going to be deliberately hurt over and over again, outside of my control, by a person with zero compassion for me. And it lends itself to this idea that it will never end until I die, right? Sure. It's a construction of the worst case scenario. Can you think of a much worse way to die than being tortured? Like, truly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that if I was in a situation where I was either stuck, like in a building that was crumbling down on fire, or somebody was torturing me, I would probably choose torture simply because the torture by nature of somebody doing it sadistically means that they have a vested interest in making it last as long as possible, which is for me, right? But I would rather have to overcome another human who could make mistakes based on their own delusions, rather than the laws of physics and fire, which I mean,
yeah. So you're saying that there might be an escape.
Right.
Yeah.
But if it were guaranteed,
yes.
Like if somehow I knew that this was nothing that could be done, then yeah, I'd probably just,
any other form of death sounds better than that, right? Like if it's guaranteed that that's the way you're going out and you're going to spend the next 30 days getting your fingernails pulled out and like
eyes gouged out and everything. Yeah.
Hard pass. And
it's a solid left swipe for me, good sir.
It also kind of like, it feeds on this idea too. Torture also comes down to like, this is going to get gross. So
we're talking about horror and how it relates to the human psychology. So.
But like, at what point, I'm asking you as the human person, have you ever thought, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to remove someone's eyeballs for fun. Like, it's the things that we equate to torture are things that we would like on a visceral net level, like would make us want to puke, right? And I think that's an instinctual thing, unless you're like missing, and I believe that this is the case in some instances, if you're missing certain parts of your brain that trigger that, like, oh, this is disgusting. Taking my thumbs and pulling someone's eyeballs at it, that doesn't make me feel warm and fuzzy inside.
Well, generally you don't pull them out, you would just crush them.
Whatever. It's
hey man, you're the one who wanted to stay on the topic of it, but it's
true. But I wonder too how much we can separate, like we were told that is disgusting, and that's why we have this like huge reaction to like, ew, why would anyone ever want to do that?
I think it relates to people's sense of, like you said before, about the stories of putting themselves in that spot. The reason why people have compassion for it is because they can put themselves in that position. Even if it's an animal, you can't put yourself in the position of an animal, even if you identify as one. But yes, I'm never going to stop never going to stop making fun of those people that identify as cats. But I mean, not that I hate cats more than other animals to identify as, but like you can still put yourself in the position of something which can experience suffering. And so when you lack that empathy, and this is again like something like people like to make it seem like, oh, like you have to be, your brain has to be shaped this way, or miss that thing, or not send whatever signal. This is something that perfectly, in quotes, normal people do every day. And so it's like, again, it comes back to that notion.
What is
the notion of what torture comes back to, which is to intentionally cause suffering to something.
Oh, okay.
With lacking in compassion. Because if you think about it, torture is just a scale. Okay, like
it's an extreme.
Yeah, like if you're a parent and your, I don't know, daughter wants to go see her boyfriend or whatever, and like you enjoy not letting her do that because when they had like a party last time, like they knocked over like, I don't know, like a grandmother's vase or something and it broke. It doesn't change whatever the rightness or wrongness of that vase breaking situation, but to enjoy being able to take away the autonomy, not to just enforce a consequence, because those are, again, two different things, but to enjoy doing that, to me, there's no difference.
I agree with you. It's I would classify it as intentionally inflicted pain.
Yeah, it's cruelty.
Yeah, in any capacity would, I mean, semantics, right? Like, so like the level of the pain may differ, but if anyone who is intentionally inflicting pain on another person, which I don't believe is, it's my personal belief that is more rare than we think it is.
In experiencing enjoyment, you mean, right? Because I think there's also
that people, I choose to believe that people don't live their lives and wake up in the morning and think, how can I intentionally inflict pain on another person for fun? And if they are of that mindset, it's this mantra that hurt people, right? They're suffering. And the only way that they feel like they can deal with their own personal suffering is to make someone else suffer. Sort of like the idea of in groups and out groups. Well, if you're not in my group, I'll make you in my group because you have to be able to relate to me. And that we're sort of talking about a different level, but in general, typical people, I don't believe ever choose to inflict pain or harm on someone on purpose just for funsies. Like it's not, but it's a fear we have. So again, back to like all of horror is fear-based. That's like the whole point of it. And how better to find the fears that speak to people than like your innermost concern, which if it comes down to, I'm afraid I will be hurt by another person. That could be emotionally, that could be physically, that could be, there's all different, everyone knows there's a lot of ways to get hurt. But yeah, I think that is why torture, it hits a little different than like zombies and like witches and like what else is a horror theme?
Being buried alive.
Well, that one's gross. Yeah.
Being eaten by a shark.
Being
like transforming into like another creature, like it, or not it, the thing. The thing, they're anonymous pronouns.
That's an interesting archetype though, because up until now we've been talking almost exclusively about things that will kill you, being buried alive.
Yeah, being done to you by external things as well.
I'm thinking of the one with Emily Blunt, where you it's like there's a recent popular horror movie was like they're not allowed to talk because there's like a monster, and if they talk, it'll get them. So like they live in. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I remember that there was one where there was a blind man that they were afraid of getting killed by, but I don't remember the one with the monster. I don't watch a lot of horror, but I watch reviews of it.
But point being, it's going to kill me. That is. But what you were just saying is not it's going to kill me. It's going to take me over and turn me into something else.
Right.
Which, I mean, essentially is sort of similar because it's like loss of self, loss of life, loss of self. Like, is there a difference? If you were taken over by a host and it's just your body, are you dead? Now we're getting into the
foolishness,
existential.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the common, like the themes are all really the same.
Yeah, and I think the notion of, again, like horror is like the reflection of these things, where it's the same thing where like, possession. Like Lana said, that's another example. I was just thinking of kind of the physical example, but possession is interesting because then it is still something external to you that's simply controlling you, right? Being chased by something, yeah. And I think that a lot of it comes back to powerlessness as well.
Yes, helplessness. Agreed.
Because there is suffering, right? But then if you think of the notion of, like, depending on the movie, possession doesn't always have the host aware of what's going on. Sometimes they're just gone and it's just, whatever's possessing them. Or when you have like something that, like, I think that that's an element of zombie horror as well. And I mean, there has to be a reason why that lasted so long, right? Aside from just whatever else. Because the notion that no matter how much somebody loves you, no matter what you mean to them or whatever else, as soon as they get bit, there is a timer until you mean nothing to them at all besides something to eat. I
Mhm.
think that also speaks to, that fear of, somebody who is like unthinkably valuable to us just not caring. Again, like you said, it's a reflection of that fear,
Mhm.
of that powerlessness, not even of ourselves, but even maybe of the other person, where like it doesn't matter what you think, how much you care, whatever, like this is going to happen. And even just that inevitability of things like that, I think comes back to the fear of death as like the clock, the countdown.
Yeah, I was thinking the same
Because
thing.
again, the human experience is defined by denying how things are and choosing to make them different. Think about it. Even
Yeah,
just
well,
fire, the wheel, all this other stuff is like, well, I don't feel like carrying all this up the hill on my own. I'm gonna put, I'm gonna put this log on top of these wheels and then put something on top of that log so that I can just pull it along. Like, we have been changing our external environment so that it can fit what we want since we were, aware of being conscious of other things. But when you have this inevitability of whether it's death or that you're going to suffer at some point, or the people you love are going to die, you're going to age, you're going to lose your looks, whatever it is.
mhm,
I think that there's an element to that inevitability that is as terrifying to human beings as anything else, because it comes back to that powerlessness, you
yes,
know?
we love control. And we're problem solvers by nature, right? Like
Mm,
when you brought up the wheel and fire, those are ways we solved problems. Um, and like, it's the problem that we're gonna die someday. We'd like to
yeah,
not. Existing is pretty cool most of the time. But I think you're right that even like if we're sort of like switch, I don't want to say switching gears, but just looking to the side a little bit of
sure.
like where we see like mental health concerns the most, it really does have to do with control and feeling out of control.
Mm,
Or feeling like I can't control this, or because I can't control this, now I can't function the same way. So like things that trigger depressive episodes, grief, loss of a loved one, things that trigger anxiety and panic disorders, um, are feeling like you are it's literally feeling like you are out of control. So this is like such a deep rooted fundamental fear that people have, and it
mm,
connects to all sorts of different things, whether it's death, or when we were talking about torture, I am out of control of what somebody else is able to do to me. um it's just like, I bet you if we looked at any horror movie, we could identify how the theme is connected to lack of control.
mm,
And like it just comes down to that every time. um but also like it's interesting to why people gravitate toward it. So we talked about how one of our theories on this episode is that because it's taboo to speak about these fears, just like in general in society to each other, we can do it through storytelling and through like this mechanism. But I also wonder if there is like a mechanism related to dopamine and adrenaline that keep people coming back to these movies,
yeah, like the
right?
shock of this and so on.
Like I can safely get my fix of this kind of like, holy fight or flight, like I'm going to get aroused essentially by it. Don't take
Mhm.
that the wrong way. But like my sympathetic nervous system, which is like your fight or flight, this is like what's going to get you up and moving, go
Right.
go go go, that is going to be aroused by these themes being presented to you, right? So it's almost like a cheap hit of adrenaline and dopamine from watching these movies,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
in the safety of your own home.
Right. Yeah. It's that ability to live out like that dramatic situation. Same thing as like people watching, whatever bodybuilder is running around, whatever, like shooting people, being a one-man army power trip. You know what I mean? That again, like that's going to be like that flush of whatever the hormones are, but I'm probably dopamine and like whatever else. Uh, Watching romance movies, like all these things, to extend it beyond just the horror element. Again, it is about experiencing the essence of that experience. If you really think about it,
Yeah.
uh, like mm, romance doesn't generally work in real life like it does in movies.
No, especially in horror movies. Think about the romance you see in horror
Mm.
movies.
Yeah, true. Like there's never really, well, I guess it also depends on the genre, because you have something like say like the story, and I don't mean the teen movie version, but I mean like a version that's like, it's an adult understanding of it. Like if one person is in love with like a ghost or something like that, or somebody who becomes a ghost, even that, it kind of connects with something that's less I guess taboo and more just kind of like part of the human experience of like what happens like when somebody you love dies. You know what I mean? And like you can't let go. Like that's, I think, a big element of what ghosts come back to you, because it's in some ways it's easier to imagine that something is less than it was than that it's gone completely.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's kind of like the human mind unwilling to really just address the fact that it's, I'm not going to say moved on, because I don't necessarily think of it that way, but it's, that it's not there anymore. uh, just that element of people examining something that they're probably afraid to talk about, even when it's not something that's taboo, that they just don't feel like they can talk about with people in real life, and that they'll get a legitimate no BS answer. I think that that's another element of it. So it's kind of like uh, my pal Lana does like a lot of different kinds of work, whether it's coaching, energy, a lot of stuff. And one of the concepts that she's mentioned to me before is what's called shadow work. And I'm not going to put uneducated words in her mouth based on my limited understanding of it, but essentially you're examining the things in yourself that normally you would not necessarily want to see or whatever, like the things
Yeah.
that make you afraid of, I don't know, like why you're terrified of dogs, or whatever else it is, claustrophobia and so on. And I think that that is essentially what horror is it's that shadow work where it's essentially projecting this, whatever this fear is. And even just the notion of like why people are attracted to different kinds of horror. Because for
Mhm.
example, I love like like abandoned houses, mansions, even asylums and stuff like that. And I love like the notion of like an overarching world in it. I'm a writer. It makes sense that I would
Yeah.
find things
Yeah.
like that more interesting compared to, like, for example, this is an interesting thing. I wonder what I don't know if sexographic is the whatever the term is. I know like demographic, like people will say, oh, what's the demographic of this? But demographic is a specific kind of
Oh,
graphic.
like,
So
yeah. Yeah. Like
yeah,
narrowing the funnel. Mhm.
right. But I wonder what the sex-based demographic, whatever you would call it, is of fans of Saw, because I have only ever known female fans of the Saw series,
Wow. That is an interesting. Yeah.
which doesn't mean, you know what I mean, like that
Yeah. Yeah.
there are no guys that like it, but I do wonder what that division is, because if you think about it, that sense of like this person did all these things wrong and now they're going to pay for it. I
Mhm.
think that generally, at least in America, like America culture wise, the way that women tend to see how that's going to come is generally different. Again, this is obviously changing as the cultural experience changes compared to guys, because with like a lot of guys, like it's the power trip. Like I'm going to go do this thing. I'm going to shoot you. I'm going to do this or whatever. Like it is that very like, going to war kind of feeling, which makes sense because like in nature, that's how, the guy
Yeah.
would get the problem. But if you think of like how, like hunter-gatherer days, how women would handle, like, say, for example, issues in the group or whatever, while the guy is out spearing a boar or something like that, like how psychologically that would work, there would be that sense of like the organization is enforcing its authority on this. And so
Mhm.
when you think of these people did all these wrong things, but now they can't outrun it anymore. Now they are forced to deal with it in this inescapable kind of sandbox situation. I find it interesting to think about, that division of how the fan base works that way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And similar to that, like most people have something in their past that they would love to never have to think about again. Like everybody makes mistakes. Everybody's got that fucking one thing that they're like, oh, hope like no one ever finds out about it, or no one ever brings it up again, or I'd like to never have to revisit XYZ, right? Because
Right.
literally everyone makes mistakes at some point in their life, and it's just part of it. So like the idea of those movies is also capitalizing on, what if I actually do get like genuinely punished for the thing I believe that was wrong that I did? Because like, let's face it, like legally, if I wanted to go out and cheat on my husband and like home wreck another home at the same time, I can do that with no actual legal repercussions for that, right?
Yeah, aside
There
from like
are
maybe like a divorce, like based on like design, like whatever that term would like, yeah.
Yeah, but like the no one's going to arrest me for that, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's a moral thing that I get the punishment from that. Like the other consequences in my life that would come from if I chose to go do that right now are not from like the law. And I never have to tell anyone in my future that I did that. If I want to go start living my life after I choose to do those things, I don't have to tell anyone that like, oh, well, I was married. I could say I was married, but I don't have to be like, I was married, but then I chose to cheat on my husband and home wreck someone else on purpose.
Right.
So like
Just kind
you
of
get to
wrapped up
leave
with it.
that behind you. This is kind of an extreme example,
No, but I
but
mean, yeah.
yeah, the idea is that if that haunts you and someone else at some point is going to come after you and punish you for the thing you did, because there was no other way you were going to get punished aside from natural consequences, obviously. But
Right.
like, I don't know, that is like a very powerful driver that
Yeah.
like, especially the way we beat ourselves up in society. Like I've been doing a lot of sort of research into this idea of self-compassion and the idea that we're very hard critics of ourselves. I think most people will agree that they're their worst enemy and that
Yeah,
they're
your
going to
own
be
worst critic. Yeah.
more of an asshole to themselves about something they did wrong or whatever than like anyone else is really going to. Like the punishment comes from how much you berate yourself, right? And I think that there's this fear that like, well, if I'm this cruel to myself and no one else is at some point, is there gonna be someone who's the same level of mean that I am to myself, right? Like it's gonna catch up eventually. I don't know. It's interesting though.
Yeah, because it comes back to that whole thing of like when people do something like, cheat, or like the most messed up ones where like they go out of their way to like to show it's, like, I don't know, like doing like a live stream of it on the person's birthday or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
Oh yeah, no,
the
there's
extra
Scum.
things.
yeah.
That comes from like such a, to me, like disgusting place that like either that person would have to spend like the rest of their life so like so self-centered and like uncaring about those other things. Like it would have to just not occur to them. It'd have to like be locked away or whatever. Or they would do that in that one moment where it's like it was just an emotional flare up or whatever, whatever it would be, like just the planets aligned, and then the planets don't align anymore, but they still did it. And there's that notion where like, again, we are all animals, and whether you choose to see it as sin or just the fact that you are working more or less with the same brain as when all it had to deal with was, ooh, tiger
Yes.
bad.
We forget this all the time. It's the
Yeah.
same fucking brain. It hasn't really developed in the last, 50,000 years. So
Right.
just remember that. Yeah.
And yet you still need to, you're still made to deal with the consequences. Well, or you're not, which is kind of like what you were talking about. It's like when you're not, but there's that expectation of consequences, and there is that enforced sense of this leads to that as soon as you're out of the moment where you're just doing the thing that you're getting that kick out of, you realize like what's coming, right? Because like you said, about like fearing like what if this happens, there's a series called Silent Hill, actually, which is I haven't it's predominantly a video game series, but they've also made movies of it. And I think they went into this more in the games, but there were a lot of people who these things would happen to them, or I think that something would even be created that would be a sense of punishment for them. And so, for example, there are like these nurses in there that are like incredibly sexy looking aside from their faces. And it's kind of like, I think like a sense of punishment. I may be completely wrong about this, but it's essentially that thing of like, like the women who were just like born hot, essentially like pretty or whatever. I mean, you're not born hot because you're born a baby.
That would be fucked up. That sexy baby.
Yeah, no, we can't talk about this topic in like consecutive episodes.
No,
it's gonna
no, absolutely not. The
but
police are gonna come for us.
But that notion of how, for example, like the girl who's been hot her entire life, like how she, like maybe like winking at this police officer, or, whatever, using the power essentially, you know what I mean? Like just to put it in a term, but then that notion of what about when this whole smoke and mirrors isn't enough, you know what I mean? Or that sense of feeling ugly, knowing that, it's like, oh yeah, like there's like this attractive veneer, but like I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm doing this thing to this person or that thing to that person, or like the adultery, like what you're talking about, like being unfaithful. That kind of stuff is the entire point of those things. So,
or to spin off of that as well, if I connect my entire self-worth to my ability to be hot and look good, and I lose that, have I lost my entire self-worth? Right. Yeah. This is why like newer research is coming out, and it's like sort of showing that when you tell kids like, oh, you're such a pretty girl or whatever, like, oh, what a handsome young man, you're saying I approve of you based on this thing that you have no control over, right? So that's why there's like this drive to praise kids for effort and things that they can control, because it makes for like more rounded human beings. Now, argue in the comments about that all you want to. If you want to call your baby pretty, I'm not going to yell at you. You know what I mean? Like, that's up to you. But there is this idea, especially for girls that are hot. Is that all you're good for? If that's all you're praised for, is that sort of what you identify as who you are? Oh, I'm the hot girl in 6th grade or whatever. Right. And I use 6th grade because I think that is the peak at which you identify where your worth is, and if you're ugly or whatever. Like, there's an middle school is like a very insular time in life where like nobody else really knows what's going on except for like the other middle schoolers in your life. You don't talk to your parents about it anymore. Like, you start getting more private about things, and there's this hierarchy develops that wasn't there before. And so like, well, if I'm the pretty girl in 6th grade, that's who I am. So if I ever like, I don't know, I think this is why kids hate getting braces so much. It's like, oh no, now I can't be pretty because I have braces, and now my whole self-worth is destroyed as a result. But to your point, like, maybe that establishes in like middle school or whatever, but it carries into adulthood. So if you have in your formative years been like, I am a pretty person, I am an attractive person, and as you grow, you realize that that is something that can be taken away from you. That's a deeply ingrained fear. Well, I don't have worth anymore if I'm not hot. I'm 30 and, I've gotten by doing whatever and whatever. But if I'm not hot, like, everyone I know thinks of me that way, or at least this is how I perceive the world, that this is what people think of me, right? So if I got in an accident and my face is disfigured, that ruins my whole life because that's where I've built my worth from. So like, I don't know, these horror movies, I guess, are really getting at like much deeper psychological, like concepts for well-being, and just like poking very sensitive spots, right? Or conversely, if you are an ugly person, which like these are very broad terms, how does that relate to your self-worth? Have you already decided that because you are ugly, you don't have a lot of self-worth? Like, and how do you reflect on that in these kind of situations? So
Yeah.
anyway, sorry, tangent, soapbox.
No, it's okay, because I think it's like even just the notion of like, for example, to use that ugly instance, you think of like the what is it, the something on Notre Dame, what is it, the Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yeah, that's a great
You know,
example.
that's an example where, granted, the story has been told different times, so I'm sure that the meaning of it changes, but I think that there was like one version, I think that at least in one of the versions, like the Hunchback loves like this beautiful woman or whatever, and like she doesn't love him back. There's probably some version where she, you know, at least like at least lets him in the friend zone, you know, where it's
I think that's a Disney version.
but even just that notion of, you know, like, oh, like because you're ugly, you know, as is perceived, you are necessarily limited.
Yeah.
In that sense, there's that notion. And then there's also that the instances like when somebody, like if they feel ugly but then they become loved or whatever, like that's, you know, that's more a reflection of the human's desire to be loved in spite of this thing that they see as a fault.
Please accept
And then when
me.
you go to like horror movie or whatever, this is actually, a lot of people are usually disfigured in horror movies as well, particularly the bad people as well, almost as like a physical manifestation of what's wrong with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I'm sure that there's a movie out there where there is a bunch of hot people who get killed by somebody who's disfigured, and the only person who lives was the one who was kind to something, you know what I mean, along the way, because it's you know, it shows that it's like, and I bet there are people who just get off on that where it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter how hot you are, you're dead.
I'm like reminded of that scene in Billy Madison where he was the bully and he calls up, what's his name? Steve Buscemi. And he's like, hey, I was scum in high school and then I picked on you or whatever. Like, I'm like back in high school and these people are bullying me, because it's Billy Madison, the movie. And he's like, oh, thanks for calling me, Billy. And they get off the phone and he just Steve Buscemi takes a lipstick and crosses Billy Madison's name off his hit list. Because like the idea that you harmed me so much for being different, I'm going to harm you, which goes back to where we were talking about hurt people. And this idea of being out of control, when you're being picked on or when someone is bullying you, you are out of control. So there's like a rumination on that where you're like, well, I'm going to find the control and then I'm going to get you.
Right. And so, even just that notion that he crossed his name off the list, because now he's experienced the pain. Now he has experienced what Steve Buscemi had experienced, which comes back to what you talked about before. It's like, oh, you can't relate to me, you don't understand me, but now you will.
I will force you to be a part of my in-group. You have to have these experiences that I have had. Yeah, interesting.